So, welcome back to the Contrarians. We've got another esteemed panel assembled here where we're talking about a kind of a one very deep question here. I don't know exactly where this is going to go, but we're calling this the value of new old music. And it sounds like a topic that I came up with. I think I came up with this one because, yeah, I have a strange philosophy about this, but I'm dying to hear what these guys say on the topic. So, I think what the idea here is we're talking about discovering new music that happens to be old versus perhaps what it's like to discover just new music, people putting out new albums or in fact new bands or whatever. So we're talking specifically, I suppose, arguing for this value that there is in discovering old music. Do I have that more or less right, guys? Is that it? Okay. All right.
So did anybody, I'm going to throw this out there. Did anybody hear who came up with the topic? Anybody here?
I'm pretty sure it was me.
Well, okay. Well, I'm just asking because it could have, we do these topics so far back that God only knows.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, let's go around the horn here. We'll do it as we see it. Let's talk to the Elder of Rock first of all. What do you think of this idea?
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I like finding old music. I not too long ago I discovered a band called The Creation that were formed in 1966. Heard them on a soundtrack to a movie, and I liked their songs. And to tell from the movie, I really couldn't tell if they were an old band or just a new band trying to sound old.
Right.
But discovered them, went out and got one of their best of collections, and love it. And I think it's a cool thing to do, and definitely.
Yeah, I think the idea with this, and when my turn comes, I'll get into these concepts. Is there a different way, or is there a different value, or different things that are attached to discovering bands with 10 albums from the mid '80s versus a new band? And do you feel you get as much reward of that or less? We'll come back to the Elder. Let's go over to Tom. Tom, tell us what you think on this topic.
All right. Well, I may have broken the rules a little bit because I think it said something about bands you'd never heard of. So some of these bands I had heard of, I just was like, you're late coming to the train, but then you get really into it and you love it. So that's kind of where I was coming from, that angle of like, okay, I've heard of this band before, but I never really dove in to the extent that I did until years and years later. And then you realize, oh my God, this is a fantastic band with an amazing catalog, and I missed a lot of it. So some of my picks are actually downright embarrassing. I'll get to that later, but it's literally to the point of like, I can't believe it took me so long to get into this band kind of thing. And but in some cases I had heard of these bands. And maybe I heard a single here and there, or maybe I heard a little bit, I don't know, some way, somehow, or knew a little bit about them, but I never really dug in. Because when I dig into a band, I really dig in. I go deep, and I want everything, And I think a lot of people on this channel are probably the same way. Once you're into a band, you're really into them. So, I mean, for example, my first example is, and also I was going to say, I love this topic because there are a lot of people that say, well, you're listening to stuff that's old. Like there's a lot of people guys that I know that are like, they're really into new stuff and new releases, which is great. But whenever I talk about old stuff, they're like, oh, Curlis, you're living in the past again, man. You're back in the 70s again. Like, come on, man, get current. There's a lot of new music out there that you're just, but anyway, I'm into finding, it's like a history lesson when you find a band that you didn't know about, or you really dig into it. So anyway, so here's an example. Like, okay, I had always heard, I heard this guy, Brian Eno. Okay, I was a huge Genesis fan. He was on Lamb Lies Down. I was like, okay, who's this Brian Eno guy on this record? That was the first time I had heard about him. Then I heard he was producing U2, and I was like, okay, this guy's producing U2. Then I heard he was a band called Roxy Music. So and then I heard he was on Bowie records. I saw his name on Bowie albums. So I was like, oh, who is this guy? Like, he's everywhere. Obviously, musicians love him. But then I'd heard he made solo records. And I finally, after years and years and years of kind of knowing who this guy was and I finally bought this. And Another Green World was one of his solo records, and I just loved it. I was like, oh my God, this album's great. Where was I? What took me so long to get into this guy's solo records? So then, once I bought this and loved this, then I bought this one, loved this one. And this is his second album. Then I bought, finally found this one and the first solo album. I mean, and it was like all of these records. I love all of them. And then another one, this one, and then Before and After Science. I mean, and I'm going, wow, this guy I love his solo stuff. So it was like this whole ocean of stuff that I didn't know anything about. And I finally discovered it and loved it.
Yeah.
So that's one example for me.
Cool.
I don't know if you want me to keep going or move on to the next person.
Yeah, it's when I envisioned bringing up this topic, I did not even think about bringing up any examples at all, any picks, right? It's more the philosophical concept of like, do you get more value out of a band that there are reviews out there, there's a history, there's a start time, a stop time. They're older than you. They're your same age. They're not 30 years younger than you, kind of thing. They're making these records at the same time other bands you love are making records. It's those kinds of concepts that I was sort of wondering about. And I would argue that for myself, well, I guess I'll as the moderator, I'll just throw things out in bits and pieces here and then we'll move on. But I think I'm going to be arguing for myself that there's these extra 4 or 5 or 6 layers that I feel rewarded in going to find a band from a genre that I might have even not paid a lot of attention to in 1982 or whatever, or the 70s, and versus finding someone new doing that same sound 10 times removed because 30 or 40 years has gone by, that sort of thing. So I'll stop there with the whole concept. But to me, I just wanted to kind of discuss the concept. But Grant, let's go over to you. What have you got to say?
Oh, I'm totally into it because like on my own channel, on Grant's Rock Warehouse, I try to talk about a lot of these bands that no one talks about. Mm-hmm. Now, one of the bands that I got turned on was like Mayday. Mm-hmm. They put out this record like in 79, it went nowhere. But the thing is with this is that there's so much great music out there, and there's so many of these bands that tried to make it, they went by the wayside, and you can listen to a lot of these things like Riggs, 1982, they were on the heavy metal soundtrack. What a great record that Riggs album is. But they went nowhere, and then they would break up, and some of these band members would go on to something else. But you listen to a lot of this stuff, then you go, my God, how did this not make it? The thing is, when you go back in time, don't forget, a lot of this stuff was put in place in the 60s. Don't forget, the 60s was a time where everything was fresh and new, and there was a lot of creativity. The 60s went on to the 70s. There was a lot of innovation. Things were growing. It was an extension of the 60s. The 80s, whole other thing. We really didn't have anything really new until like the 80s when hip hop and rap came, because everything else was just something that grew what happened in the 60s. But there are so many bands back in those days that just didn't do anything. And there's no reason why. There's probably only so many positions out there. But as you look at it, I'm just going to use Rock Candy for I'm not anything to do with Rock Candy, but my God, they put out so many things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Of these bands that got lost back in the day. And you listen to it and you're going, oh my God, like this Mayday CD. Absolutely brilliant. Another one, what was Aviary from 1979 that came out on Epic. I've been raving about Aviary for a whole year. Absolutely stunning stuff.
So my point is, I'll just dole out these little points along the way, but there you say put in place in the 60s. So there's a studio system where all these guys have to spend a lot of money to make a record with a producer. Yep. You find an old band like this, you're able to look them up on Wikipedia, and there's that poignancy of, oh, this guy died and that guy died, or they supported Kiss on a tour. That's pretty interesting. They made this one album. They changed direction when New Wave came in. You can read the whole wiki thing on it. You could read the excellent Rock Candy liner notes on it, right? So there's something about just the neat study you can make when you're finding these old bands. And again, they're operating, I always make the joke, them and me both know remember fax machines, right? Or they're making this album before 9/11 happened. Nobody, it's interesting listening to this record. There was no internet, there was no 9/11 or whatever, right? They're making this record before there ever was an Iron Maiden or something like that. And right. So there's all these extra layers with these old bands. And as long as you don't know anything about them, it's just as valid to treat
just
it
as
as a productive thing. And you're not just being an old person doing it.
No.
You're literally you're taking a big canvas of music, a white canvas of music, and you're daubing your little bits of paint in various parts of the canvas, but it doesn't have to be on the newest front edge of the canvas.
No, there's so much to discover. There's so much to discover in the past.
Yeah.
Because a lot of that was cutting edge. There's really nothing cutting edge now. It's a rehash of what was already.
I don't know. I think there's always
like what? Give me an example.
Stuff, but I mean, hip hop, new metal, industrial metal,
79.
Today's deathcore, synth pop. So there's always new stuff. Thrash came out. Whatever Pantera was doing came out. So I don't. That's not particularly the point, but the minor extra point is that it does bother me. It's like someone sends me a thing. Oh, you got to go hear this new stoner rock band, right? It's like, well,
it's all been done before.
300 stoner rock bands. I can go back and listen to this is one thing I hear about old people all the time. I can go back and listen to Black Sabbath, but I can even take the intermediate view and say, I can go back and remind myself of the 30 great stoner rock bands that came out in 1995 and 1996 on those stoner rock labels that I forgot about, that I don't even remember those records anymore.
I had a buddy who we used to talk music, and I would say, hey, Keith, listen to this. He said, well, yeah, that's great, but this was done back in the day. I think what's really great about this, but yeah, Black Sabbath was cutting edge. Who was doing anything like that? A lot of these bands were like I don't want to say copy bands, but were influenced by that. You can go back to the original thing. And this is what I like a band like Mayday. I keep bringing it up, which is such a great record. Hell, I could bring this up too. Stampede went by the wayside, but there's a lot of stuff back in that era when everything was a little bit more fresh and new and not rehashed later. So it's like an archaeological dig.
Yeah.
This is what I find it exciting to find something new from a different era.
Yeah. Okay.
It's like digging up a T-Rex.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
All right. Let's move around. So to keep things tidy, Elder, you got cut off there. Anything else you want to add at this point, or do you want to wait till later, or?
Yeah. Well, just what you're talking about with, I went back and discovered now, I've been discovering a lot of the old hip hop and rap from the 80s and 90s.
Right.
Especially just a group called Das Effects from the 1990s. And it's really cool hearing that. I like hearing that old hip hop because it's more organic, not computerized. And so you have a good point about, discovering types of music from back then, that kind of where it came from and where it all started.
Mm-hmm. Cool. All right. Let's move around to Marco. Anything to add?
Yeah, just thinking about the topic. I thought this was a really cool topic, and I wanted to jump on. I was supposed to be on last night, but so I figured I'd make up for it by jumping on this one. But no, I get a lot of value out of discovering new old music, and I learned early on in my music career. I mean, obviously we all listen to music because it brings us enjoyment. So I learned early in my music career, I kind of didn't really like greatest hits albums or best of albums, because I would pick up a best of album and I probably already was familiar with half the songs because of the radio. So you pick up a greatest hits AC/DC album, you probably already know 75% of the songs. So very early on, I decided to kind of stay away from greatest hits albums. I mean, they were kind of cool if you didn't know anything about a band, but then if you really like the band, you end up buying their old albums and you've already knocked off a few of the songs. So you're kind of losing value. If you buy a greatest hits album from a band that you end up enjoying and you want to collect all their albums, because you go back and buy a classic album, there's already 3 songs that you're familiar with, you're losing value. So I find the value in discovering music that I like that brings me enjoyment. And going back, well, first of all, anything that comes out today is old tomorrow anyways. So everything's all old, new, old music within a matter of time anyway. But when I go back and I can find bands that line up with the types of music that I enjoy, like I love the Beatles and I love the Rolling Stones. If you go back and if I go back and I find if I go back and buy a Rolling Stones album, like I'm not a super physical media guy. Like I love music, I love listening to the songs. I can listen to them digitally. It's all about the songs for me. If I can go back and buy a Rolling Stones album, 9 times out of 10, I'm probably very familiar with half the songs on the album already. But if I go back and discover a band like the Loved Ones and pick up an album and I don't really know any of the songs, and they're kind of right in line with that type of music that I already enjoy, there's value right there, because I'm getting more out of it than I would if I go back and listen to classic bands that I'm already very familiar with because of the radio or because of music videos or because of I heard the songs in other friends' cars and I heard, you know what I mean? So for me, there's a value in, like, Grant said, the hunt, the discovery of it is exciting, but also just, we listen to music because it's an exercise of our brain. We get enjoyment out of it. We get value out of listening to music already. So I don't think there's anything wrong with going back and discovering stuff that I wasn't aware of. And again, I grew up in the 90s. So already there were so many genres that came and went before I was even listening to music, really, seriously. Like I missed the whole punk thing of the 70s. So should I just never go back and listen to punk because I missed that whole thing? Right? No, like I went back and I listened to the Ramones and I gained something out of it. It was a brain exercise. It was getting, again, that enjoyment piece. So yeah, I definitely think there's a value in going back and discovering old bands and going and discovering new bands that are coming out. That's my whole relationship with music is discovering new bands.
See, I guess my point is that I almost want to drive home the point even more that there's added layers of value to going back and discovering old bands even over new bands. Like I'll just give another quick example, like that example where I constantly getting people recommending, oh yeah, if you like stoner rock, listen to this great new band. I almost want to fight with them and say, you know what? You've just reminded me. I've got 3 or 4 Melvins albums. I love the Melvins, idea of the Melvins. I love their sound. I love their singing. I think the vocals. I think the whole idea is cool. I can't remember a single thing on the 3 or 4 Melvin albums I have. And by the way, don't they have 12 or 15 albums? It's like if someone literally came to me and said, you know what, you can only listen to the Melvins for the rest of your life, right? I would be like, yeah, I'm probably okay with that. I'll just go become a Melvin. I'll have my whole personality shaped by the Melvins for however many years I have left. It's that extreme, right? Where it's like there's so many bands out there where I could just say, you know what? I call them retirement bands, right? I've been using that term for decades, right? It's like I could see when I retire taking 2 whole months and just immersing myself in this catalog, right? That already exists. And it's old music, but yet to me, it's like way cooler than a new band that just started in 2005 that's got 4 albums.
There's history. There's legacy. The thing is, the stoner band that someone throws out to you, are they doing anything really different than what the Melvins might have done? That's what I'm saying. Yeah. I'd rather listen to those bands or those artists that were cutting edge, that paved the way for everybody else. Because you're just if you listen to something later, I'm not saying everything.
Yeah,
but
I don't want to put bands down like that, though.
No, but I'm just saying
there are nuanced new ways that everybody's doing something new. So it's like I don't want to go too far that way, but it is a little bit of that old curmudgeonly thing saying, if I like that band, you know what? I've got probably on my CD wall, my 7 foot tall by 31 feet long CD wall, I probably have 250 excellent stoner rock albums that I can't remember a thing about. Like that's all I need. I don't need any new bands. So anyways, enough. Let's move on to the Parish or actually, sorry, Parish. If we could indulge you for a second, Nick, is this a perfect time for you? Do you want to knock off your piece? Is this ideal for you?
it's not ideal, but it's probably the best.
Okay, well then say your piece, and I apologize again, Parish, for leaving you last. So
no, that's okay. It's not a problem.
Okay.
Yeah, and for me, I missed some of it because I got a bad cell connection. But so what I may say maybe typical of what others said. But to me, I find music is not disposable; it has value. So even if it's old and new to me, I feel like as a student of history, a student of archaeology and sociology, I find value in old music. That's why I collect 78s. I collect old stuff. I have a connection to that music because it appeals to me more than newer stuff. So these are some of the reasons I'm ticking off. Even though there's greater technology and a greater maybe listening experience, I don't necessarily need that. I have more of a connection to older music as a rule. And as a result, there's an infinite number of choices I found out there, and I'm still mining, I'm still digging, I'm still finding stuff, and it'll go on forever. And it's been such an enriching thing. I like to find the connections with the music where I know about a band, but there's a musician who played in a band, they played in another band, like Bob Daisley. Go find a Widowmaker album. Go find Mungo Jerry, that kind of stuff. So I found amazing amount of things through these connections. So for me, just as a philosophical thing, I so enjoy the old music or the new old music. I can give you examples for days and days. There's a thing with me too, and maybe you guys discuss this, but like I could spend all day watching an old movie. I could look at old artwork or old stuff, classics, old books. I can spend the rest of my life just diving into those classic old things. So again, as a philosophical thing, I love the old stuff. So
cool.
That's my piece.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Parish, take it away.
Yeah, I suppose I was going to come from this slightly differently in that for me, if I don't know the music, it's new music, whether it comes from 40 years ago or from last week. And quite often I'll get into what's a new band for me, either because through the Contrarians there's been a couple. I mean, Nick introduced me to the Good Rats a little while ago. You mentioned Avery earlier, Grant. That was one I got into when we did the Christmas Santa. Martin, you recommended Last Crack, I think it was, as an album for me, and I got into that. Yeah, and it was really good stuff. So I enjoy being part of shows like this and the Contrarians because that introduces me to bands I've just not heard of. And sometimes I think, how have I never heard of them? Because they're exactly what I like. And other times a little bit left field, but there's a lot in what I'm hearing that kind of takes aligns to what I like. So to me, that's just new music. It may be 20 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago, but if I've not heard it before, it's new stuff. So there's those bands. Then there's bands I kind of know of, but I've either only ever heard one thing by them or maybe never heard anything, but I know the name. And New England was a good example of that. I've heard of New England. I've probably heard one song by New England, but through somebody constantly talking up how they're their favourite band on Twitter, I suddenly thought, I'm going to go and have a listen to that. That sounds like my kind of thing. And again, certainly that debut album, I think it's a fantastic debut album. And to me, it doesn't really matter whether it came out last week or 50 or 45 years ago. I just think it's new music. I really like it. And then there's bands I know and I know really well, but for some reason I've either never gotten into or I just don't like, I never liked. So a good example at the moment, my favourite new band at the moment is Lynyrd Skynyrd. I never got into Lynyrd Skynyrd, and the reason I never got into Lynyrd Skynyrd is I had a friend at school who only liked two artists, Lynyrd Skynyrd and Elvis Presley. So whenever I went round his house, that's all he played. After some time, I was begging him to play Elvis Presley because I was just so fed up with Lynyrd Skynyrd. But a little while ago, I heard a song on the radio that I didn't recognise as a Lynyrd Skynyrd song that turned out was on the Lynyrd Skynyrd album. I think it's called Guns and Gods or Gods and Guns, came out sort of towards it, I think 2008, 2000, something like that. And I heard it and I thought it sounded like a Blackfoot song. So I did what you said. I then found out it was Leonard Skinner, and then I found out what album it was on, and then I realised Ricky Metlock was now part of Skinner, which I didn't know, which was obviously why there was a sort of a similarity. So through that, I kind of went back to listen to Leonard Skinner, and I now really like Leonard Skinner. Something's clicked this time round where it didn't click 45 years ago, where I absolutely love them. So to me, they're still a new band because I've never, even though they've kind of been there and I've known about them, I've never really listened to them. So, and what I like about something like Leonard Skinner is, if I go back to sort of when I was buying records to start with in the late 70s, early 80s, most of the bands I discovered had a back catalogue. So I'd start with an album. So Thin Lizzy, I'd start with an album and then I'd work backwards. Or Status Quo, I'd start with an album and work backwards. Nowadays, it's newer bands, it's harder to do that because they might only have one or two albums to go back on. But something like Leonard Skinner, there's probably 50 albums I can go back over and discover and really enjoy. So I think that's good from that point of view. But again, to me, it's just new music. So it doesn't really matter, as I say, whether it's old new music or new music in that context. And at the moment, so Leonard Skinner's an example. Another two bands I'm kind of getting into recently has been Sum 41 and Blink 182 because they're having a bit of a comeback. They're playing at the Download Festival in the summer. And I thought, I've never really got into them. I kind of know the odd song, and I'm now getting into them. And there's no reason why I shouldn't, because I like sort of punk rock, I like pop punk, I like those. But for some reason, never connected to those two bands. So to me, again, they're new bands. They're probably still got a history of 30 years, though. So they're not really new bands, but they, because I've not discovered them before or listened to them, so they're new bands. So for me, it kind of breaks down that different way between bands I know of but never really listened to and bands I've never heard of. But I do like discovering, and it was interesting, the example you used earlier, Grant, about Stampede. So I know Stampede. I saw Stampede about 5 times back in the early 80s. But it's a good example of discovering, because if you looked up Stampede, you'd see that the lead guitarist was Lawrence Archer. And if you saw it was Lawrence Archer, you'd think, oh yeah, I know him. Where do I know him from? I know him from UFO. Oh, wasn't he the guitarist that Phil Lynott hung out with after, with grandson? So I can see your point, Martin. You do start to connect the dots around something that's, I suppose, effectively ancient history, but you do start to put those things together. Bit like I did when I realised that Ricky Metlock was now in Lynyrd Skynyrd.
Right.
And so because of my love of Blackfoot, that kind of drew me into that band. Does that all make sense?
Yeah, it's an archaeological dig.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll introduce another couple of quick ideas. I mean, you bring up Blink 182 or Sum 41, you can get into those bands and go, oh, here's what they're doing in 1997. Here's what they were doing in 2005, 1995. And you think, okay, what was going on in music at the time? What was going on in current events at the time, right? And what were the production techniques? So there's all these extra layers to these old bands that you didn't know before that you can look into. The last one I'll introduce is the idea of, sometimes I have a pushback against new bands because it's like I can't relate to a 22-year-old kid's bank of lyrics at my age, right? And it's like I don't really care what they're talking about. I feel like kind of alien about them. But then I remind myself that so many of these rockers that I consider wise gods of rock and roll, the odd time they were making a record when they were 19 years old, and I'm like,
it's no different.
They're my elders, right?
Yeah.
And like it blows me away when I think I can't believe how seriously I took what Paul Weller was saying, back then. To me, he's like a god, right? Like one of the wisest men ever. He's basically Ray Davies to me, right? Kind of thing. And it's like, man, he was 24 years old when he was just saying that stuff, right? That I treat so seriously. So I don't know. Anybody react to that?
Or like Geezer, or Butler, Black Sabbath. I always loved his lyrics, and he was pretty young when he wrote those.
Yeah.
Or Ozzy with the odd lyric as well,
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's the same thing. These kids writing lyrics, it's no different than when you were a kid and you listen to these artists, but it's just different,
For me,
when you're younger and you're hearing these older artists do that, you're like, God, like Martin said, they're like prophets, they're gods of rock. They're talking to me.
For me, it goes beyond the lyrics to just about the bands. Like, I sound proud to be an old man, but I cannot connect to a band that can't play a live show because they don't have their computers, because they forgot their laptops.
Right.
So I cannot get into that kind of new music. When I hear that, we can't play because we don't have our laptops. I can't get my head around that. It doesn't. I will never embrace that. So beyond the lyrics, it's that other stuff too that I cannot connect with. So I'm the old man. That's okay. Yeah. Hey, by the way, you may have mentioned this too, but in finding these old bands, there's no barriers anymore. You've got streaming, you've got YouTube. So now the archaeological dig is easier. And here's the other thing too. Radio may have dropped the ball on these bands. The record companies dropped the ball on these bands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so some of these bands, some of these artists have fallen through the cracks. And now we get to come back with the magic of the internet and the streaming and the YouTube and find them and find out, oh my God, there's so much value here. They're so cool. So anyway.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah. Anything else? Marco, Parish?
Yeah, I think part of the appeal too is when you go back and discover some older bands, especially more obscure bands, they're not homogenized, and there's a bit more authenticity when you go back and listen to some bands that weren't really mainstream. And I think that there's a value in that as well, because a lot of my appreciation for music comes from stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of catchy pop tunes, but there's countless bands that you could consider hidden gems who put out countless songs that are hidden gems. And I think that music, there's a timeless quality to good music and good lyrics and good melodies. Like, I don't think it needs to be of this time to be appreciated.
You bring up a really good point there, Marco, because that's the other thing that kind of bothers me about, say a new band trying to be a power metal band, or even let's get even more in the weeds, a new band reviving the new wave of British heavy metal sound or something. It's like, when you know that band knows every trick in the book and has had access to every new wave of British heavy metal single that they could, and they've studied it down to a fine art, and it's like basically grown in a lab. Even if they are a scruffy heavy metal band, it's still grown in a sort of lab because they have had available to them every trick in the book. So they're completely self-aware, and it's lacking that Wild West authenticity of the older music.
Well, let's look like a band like The Darkness or Ghost, for God's sakes. What is Ghost doing that's any different? Mm-hmm. They learn from the best, correct?
Yeah,
right. But it's nuanced. They are famous for a reason, and they're kind of combining
things.
Yeah.
Say that again.
They're combining things. Yeah. They're kind of combining things as well.
Yeah. Well, they're taking all those influences, but they're not doing anything new.
Yeah. Well, what do you think of a band? What do you think faces might be made? But what do you think of like baby metal, things like that, mixing this pop with this power metal sound that has really never been done before?
Exactly. Super interesting. So, it happens. Yeah. It does happen. Yeah.
So, I mean, my take on all of that is twofold, really. So, firstly, I always find the test is seeing the band live. So, if you used your sort of new band that's sort of bringing back new wave of British heavy metal, I'll go and see them, and if they're really good live, I've bought into it. If they're shit live, I won't buy into it. So that's a really good, and a lot of the newer bands that I like, I think are really good live. In fact, in many cases, I think they're far better live than they are on record. Mm-hmm. And I much prefer to see, so a band like Alter Bridge, or a band like Blackstone Cherry, I much prefer them live than I prefer them on record. I'll buy the records because I want to support them and I enjoy them, but I'll see them live every time they come around. Yeah, because as I say, I think they're really good live acts. So that's kind of the first test for me. The second, sorry, Martin.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
And then the second thing is our sort of talking about the lyrics of sort of modern bands and not connecting to it. Isn't that what rock and roll is all about, though? Isn't rock and roll supposed to be the next generation coming through and pushing the last generation out the way? You go, I just don't get it. What's that all about? And that, you know, so I'm sometimes a little bit annoyed that I actually do like these new bands that are coming through and I can relate to them, because I don't feel that it's rock and roll. I think rock and roll should be pushing me out the way and coming up with, like my dad. I mean, my dad was into the Beatles and the Stones. He couldn't get punk. He just thought it was noise and they couldn't play their instrument. And I loved that because I thought that's what rock and roll was all about. But I don't get that. My kids like the same music I like, and I tend to like the same music as they do. So there's something that kind of rebellious rock and roll thing. So the odd band that comes through that, I mean, Baby Metal is a good example, that comes through that I don't like. I kind of respect it's coming through and pushing that boundary. And it's not meant for people like me to like it. It's meant to be a different generation, a different group of people.
Yeah. You know, one thing I wanted to bring up, I mean, if you guys agree with this or not, but I think it's almost like the greatest, what are we calling this? New old music. The greatest new old music for all of us. Tell me if you agree with this argument, but to my mind, it's almost like you find that 5-year period where you were so into music, like that 15 years old to 20 years old period, right? Mm-hmm. And then I find myself extra enamored with the albums that came out in genres at that time that I paid no attention to or knew nothing about. So, exactly. You know, for me, say it was, although I'm kind of bucking that a little bit, I'm going against my own argument. But, you know, for me, the big, you know, super important time was, you know, 76 to 81 or whatever. But I find myself over the last 10 years or so really interested in 1982 and 1983 and 1984. And all these bands I thought were crap back then, you know, who at that time, within that time frame, put out 3 or 4 albums and then kept going and maybe have 6 or 10, right? So you know, post-punk for you know, being the biggest example. Like I didn't know anything about it. I didn't care about post-punk, but I find myself loving, you know, everything to do with 1982, 1983, 1984, and even giving a look in, you know, I probably won't like it and I haven't even done it yet, but, you know, I could give a look into Duran Duran and Culture Club and Madonna and stuff. I probably won't like any of it, but as an archaeologist, I look at this and go, wow, you know, it's interesting. Look at the sounds they made on a Madonna record in 1985 or whatever, right? Yeah. And, you know, I'll toss it aside pretty quickly, but the point is that you're just having time. You find some years in that old time where you go, I'm really super curious about almost everything that happened during this time that I paid no attention to during those years.
Yeah, I find that's interesting because I do that too. Like stuff I didn't normally like maybe back then. I kind of view it as being nostalgic for things you didn't like, but it reminds you of the time period. It's like I didn't used to like Huey Lewis and the News, and now I love him because it just takes me back to that time period. And it's like, yeah, I didn't used to like this, but it reminds me of this time really well of what was going on.
Yeah, good way.
Yeah.
Well, Sports is a damn good record. I will give.
Oh, it is.
That.
I love that. Yeah,
there was a reason that it was so big.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
There's no doubt that nostalgia plays a part in all this. I mean, it's as much as you want to deny it, like Martin was saying, there's that golden period when you listen to music, and it's like you feel like it's changing your life when you're like 15, 16, and you know, Tony Banks of Genesis said something like, he said it's interesting when people come up to him and say what their favorite Genesis album is. You know, like some people come up and go, oh my God, Abacab is it. He'll say, how old were you when Abacab came out? You know, or they'll say Trick of the Tail, that's the one. Well, how old were you when Trick?
It all depends where you come in on.
You're 16 every time, right?
He said it's always like 15, 16. Yeah, every time it's always that's that age.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if what I'm about to say says something about me. But if I take dance music as an example, I always hate the current dance trends. And yet 5 years later, I like it. And I've always thought I like it because it's actually better than the current trend. So in 5 years, so I didn't like soul in the early 70s, that sort of Philadelphia sound. But when disco came out, I kind of liked it. I didn't like disco, but when the electronic dance music came out, I kind of liked, and I think I liked it because I just thought it was better than what's currently here. So my taste in dance music is always 5 years behind the trends. And it maybe is partly nostalgia, but I think it's partly because you suddenly realise how bad it can get. So you kind of like I do, I realise how bad it's got. So I know
it's pretty bad right now, Parish. So
yeah, it's almost like it's had time to age, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm a big disco fan now, you know, but I hated it at the time. Absolutely hated it. And your comment about Duran Duran, at the time I hated all that new romantic stuff. I just all synthesizer, it was just kind of, to me, it was just bland pop. But now I can listen to Duran Duran and I can appreciate actually they're really good musicians. Yeah. There's some really good songs in there, some good guitar riffs, etc., some good bass line. So I can hear now something I could never hear back then. I'm not sure I'll say the same about Culture Club though.
Duran Duran. I love Culture Club. But Duran Duran was one of those bands when I heard Rio back in 81, 82, I thought like the freaking seas parted because compared to what was going on at the time, Duran Duran Hungry Like a Wolf was like a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, so I didn't like any of that, guys, but I do now.
You know what also happens is you for years and years and years moving forward, and especially now with the Contrarians, I mean, I know nothing about Tears for Fears, but I've heard you guys rave about Tears for Fears over and over and over again. Again, like the Melvins, if someone came to me and said, you know, we'll pay you $100,000, and all you can listen to is Tears for Fears for the rest of your life, I'd take the $100,000. I'd say, yeah, exactly, because I've had it on good notice that this is a brilliant band, and I will love these records forever. It's like I will take that $100,000.
But everybody's got a different story. Everybody's got a different upbringing. Everybody has different influences. But I can totally see how brilliant Tears for Fear is. And I didn't get them back in the day. When I was a kid, I went, but later on, it just all opened up and it all made sense. I mean, that first album.
For me, it takes like having a dozen times you guys raving about them for me to go, okay. And I haven't even gone and done it yet. But the point is, it's like if I had to take that $100,000, I'd probably take it. No, I wouldn't take it for $10,000, but I'd take it for $50,000 probably. You know, and but the point is, it's like that is sitting there, and will I ever get to it? I don't know. But in my life, in the back of my head, there's 120 of those Tears for Fears situations.
Well, the thing is, as you get older, though, you also become more selective. Because you just don't want to waste your time on something that you're not going to get anything out of. Yeah. Time's precious, and you want to listen to this music that really connects with you as well. So there's that aspect, you know.
Yeah.
Your tastes change as well, though, don't they? I mean,
sure.
I find the older I get, the more I like country rock. I hated country rock before. Never liked the Eagles. Somebody like Bob Seger, I wouldn't enjoy. But the older I've got, I've kind of appreciate that music now. Now that might just be getting old. Maybe you get old and you're mellow and you like some, but your tastes definitely change over a period of time, I think. And as a result of that,
my question to you would be, it's like if someone came to you and said, "Oh, there's this great new country rock album, roots rock, singer-songwriter gal out, right?" You know, in my mind, I don't know if this is with you, but in my mind, I'd go, you know what? There's I think a dozen Mary Chapin Carpenter albums I haven't even listened to yet. Yeah. I haven't even fully explored Sheryl Crow yet. It's like I don't need a new one. Right. I mean, if I'm going to do this, there is a back catalog of 1,500 albums from my era and the next era and the next era that I almost feel obligated to go to first.
And go back to those artists and those bands from that era, which were much more cutting edge, as opposed to those artists. Nothing against those artists, modern day artists that do it, but go back to the ones that really originated it, where the germination took place, and listen to those and study it.
That doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter to me if they
matters to me for some reason.
No, I know, but I'm saying it. So in answer to your question, Martin, quite often the bands that you're talking about, the new bands, happens to be because I've seen them live. They've been a support act or they've been at a festival. So in which case I will go and explore their recent, I mean, their catalogue might still be 10 years old because they're just new to me. But so I will go and look at those acts. So a couple of recent examples have been the Brothers Osborne. I got into them and I saw them at a festival, and another one was the Cadillac 3. Again, I saw them at a festival. So I think if you're introduced to them, for me anyway, I will go and look at them. If I haven't been introduced to them, then I'm more likely to go back and look at the stuff from the 70s and maybe the early 80s. So it depends how I get into that band, I guess.
Right.
It's a bit different too. Like it's kind of exciting when you're with a band that's current and you're kind of there as it's happening, than it is kind of looking at a band that's already kind of been done, like, completely. Yeah. So like there's some bands that are newer that are in genres that I appreciate, that, like, yeah, there's probably a dozen bands I should listen to first, but I kind of like the fact that I'm with this band now and I'm kind of there with them and kind of going along the journey with them and seeing them put out albums like in real time. And and those older bands, like, yeah, they've done a lot of cool stuff, and it's cool to go back and listen to them, but there's something exciting about that too, like seeing a band evolve as it's happening and being part of it and somewhat influencing it with either buying the records or not buying the records. But I wanted to bring up one other point about what Martin had brought up earlier about, I think there is a benefit to broadening horizons in general. Like, I think it's just good for me in my own personal, lifelong learning and growth to go back and, yeah, like sometimes I'll listen to some jazz stuff because I'm not into jazz, or sometimes I'll listen to some folk music or I've listened to quite a bit of blues, but I mean, like, I think there is a benefit to that, stepping out of my comfort zone, and it's, a bit of a brain experiment, and, so I think there's a benefit to that as well, like going back and discovering like other genres from different eras and things like that. So I just wanted to kind of mention that as well, the broadening horizon aspect of it.
Yeah, and the other good thing also to expand talk about having a band that you only know the hits of, and like we bring up like with Duran Duran or something like that, I only knew their hits, I didn't know their deep cuts, and so it's kind of cool to go discover all these deep cuts that you've never heard before as well. And
yeah, I find if I'm going to explore a band, it annoys me that Spotify puts all the newest stuff first, and you gotta go to Wiki to look up the album title first and stick that in there to take you all the way back, kind of thing, right? But when I'm super interested in a new old band, I want to start with the first album, and I just go forward from the first album.
Yeah.
But I will add that by doing these shows and being on these panels and being on all these different shows and stuff, you get to hear and take in a lot of different artists you might not have heard before, and you totally get turned on to something.
Yeah.
I'm just going to throw out the band Riggs. I would have never thought to go look for that one record on Riggs unless someone in the chat or someone brought it up about, hey, you should check that out.
Yeah.
It's great because we can all come together and discuss music. We can all get turned on to stuff. We can get turned on to old bands, new bands, and it's just really a wonderful thing,
Yeah.
Yeah,
well, there's that intermediate level, right, where we just simply get reminded of bands that have huge catalogs that we completely
correct. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I discovered a band on Sea of Tranquility. They were talking about a band called Macabre, and how insane the drummer was. And then I go and see they have a bunch of albums, and I'm like, cool, I get to go and discover it, and I liked what I heard, and so I was like, cool, yeah, I get to discover this band. But I don't always necessarily start with the first album. I might start with the last album that they've done,
okay,
just to see how they ended, and then because I find that kind of interesting as well, see where they ended, what was their last thing they did, and then can maybe compare it. Then I'll go back to the first album or something to see how it compares.
I always draw that comparison between Black Sabbath switching from Never Say Die over to Heaven and Hell. And to me, when they got to Heaven and Hell, there was some kind of creative wildness lost, right? There was a self-awareness and a straightforward, we kind of know what we got to do. We're entering the new age. It's almost like they're anticipating the breaking into more subgenres. And you can take that. So I was vaguely dissatisfied with Heaven and Hell versus all the early Sabbath. And you can take that argument all the way up to these newer bands doing that within genres or across genres, or having a conversation with other genres, or even for example, someone like Saxon, right? We're always constantly having this frustrating discussion about Saxon, how their last 10 albums, you could say, are the greatest Saxon albums, all of them. Because they're just leaner, meaner, brighter, well-recorded, better drumming than the scrappy old ZZ Top Kiss Saxon of Strong Arm of the Law, or Wheels of Steel, or somewhat Denim and Leather. But Strong Arm of the Law really makes the point, right? Out of all of them, right? So here's this inept, scrappy, badly recorded, simple, dull band, but we all loved them to death because there's just a charm and it was there in the time. But yet, what do you say about the new Saxon, right? And someone who is way younger than us will just come up and go, that stuff was terrible. How could you even have liked that at all, right? I mean, listen to this new Saxon. Every single department is better done with this new Saxon than the old Saxon, right? And they have a point, right? Same thing with Judas Priest to some extent. Right?
Same thing with Rush.
Yeah, well, Rush changed a lot over the years, but Saxon basically became it's like Saxon went to the gym sort of thing.
Yeah.
Same with Accept, right? It's like, here's Accept after having gone to the gym with Andee Sneap for 4 albums, right? Or whatever it is, right?
Yeah, it took me a while to accept this new Saxon because I know it's great and everything, but it just doesn't sound like the Saxon that I, knew. And so, yeah, these albums are great and I do like them, but I agree with you. There's something about that old Saxon. They're just like 2 different bands almost with the same singer,
But see, the point is new Saxon, even though they're 60 and 70 years old, just like a 22-year-old, band of pirate metal makers, right? New Saxon and those 22-year-olds now have every trick in the book known because they've had it all presented. They know every trick in the book. So it's like they're very self-aware. And that's my point with Heaven and Hell. That's the self-aware Sabbath, not the wild and crazy, hippie, drugged out, creative Sabbath, making Never Say Die and Air Dance and Breakout and stuff like that, right?
With Saxon, though, does it matter where you came into the band? Like with Rush, you have some fans that love everything, Hemisphere's back, but then you have some people that just think the 80s stuff is it, but then those people that like the 70s stuff can't stand the 80s stuff. But with Saxon, does it matter where you came into Saxon, the way you interpret them and what you like? I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah, for sure. I think a 22-year-old kid coming into Saxon is just going to have no tolerance for that old stuff at all.
Kind of like Rush. That's basically what I was saying. It just depends where you come in.
And a little bit to that point is I didn't really like Rush during that period, and now I do. I went back to it during that 80s period, but then it got all keyboardy and synthy. Right. I kind of checked out of them, but then I ended up just, okay, I'll give this stuff another chance. And it was like, there you go. And a little bit of like discovering new music, because I only knew the hits off that, not the deep cuts and everything.
I think a lot of these legacy bands can be that way because some of them change over time, and it does depend when you.
Same with Genesis.
I think Saxon, though, Saxon's quite an interesting one because I've been with Saxon all the way through, not the very first album, but I picked them up from Wheels of Steel and been with them ever since. And for me, there is an evolution over the album. There's a middle period in the sort of late 80s, early 90s where they went a bit crappy. But if you ignore that, the rest of it is an evolution. And I don't actually think, the production techniques are different, and clearly they're better musicians now because they've honed their trade. But actually, if I listen to the lyrics and the music, I don't think it's hugely different. They're still talking about the same historical stuff. They're still going back over the same sort of thing. So to me, it's just a progression. I don't think whereas Rush radically changed their styles a few times, I think Saxon has it may sound different if you listen to the latest album and Wheels and Steel, but if you've been on the journey, it's been a natural evolution, I think, rather than a radical change.
Mm-hmm.
I'll make one more totally different point. So people say, if you don't listen to new bands, new music and stuff, you're not part of the conversation. You can't have a lively, vital conversation. But the fact of the matter is, because of shows like the Contrarians, you can have you can find some old band, like say you slowly become an expert on the Smiths and you weren't before, right? Mm-hmm. Now you can have conversations about the Smiths with people. So we only have so many hours in the day and so many years left. It's like you can be part of a conversation you weren't part of before. It happens to be about the Smiths, and not some vital brand new band thing. And I'll draw a bit of a parallel. I was never a guy who sort of saw the value in knowing 2 or 3 languages, right? Because to me, it's like if you can't constantly use that language, you're going to lose it. And even you can spend hundreds and thousands of hours at that language. And I feel the defeatism of saying, well, now I can speak that language, French, say, because I'm in Canada, whatever, as well as an 8-year-old, right? And that's as good as it's going to get. And if I don't keep it up, and it's having 2 of something, you only need 1 of. There's a bit of that in it too. But my point is that I equate that with this whole thing, in that we can't keep up being experts with everything. So what you're experts in, you almost have to say, throw up your hands in defeat and say, I can't be experts in everything. I can learn a few extra things. I can slowly become an expert on the Cure or the Smiths by doing this, but I may not, be learning 25 new bands, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Did we solve anything?
I don't think we solved anything, but it was a fun discussion.
Yeah.
It's cool.
I don't know. Anything to add, or should we wrap it up?
Well, the only thing I would add to that last comment, and it's probably just from where I look at things, is I love new music. So if I didn't get into new bands, the older bands are slowly dropping away and stopping touring and playing. So if I didn't get into the new bands, at some point there won't be gigs to go to. I've just got tickets for the AC/DC. I'm certain that will be the last time I'll ever see them. I've seen them about 10 times, but that will be the last time. Mm-hmm. I'll never see Kiss again. I'll never see, allegedly I'll never see, Leonard Skinner, because I never saw them when they did come and they've stopped touring. So I do feel one of the reasons I like to get into new bands is because I know those bands are going to come around and I enjoy seeing live bands.
Yeah, Interesting. That's a great point. Yeah.
All right. At least you still have that. But, Parish, at least you have that catalog to go back to, though. Just saying.
Yeah.
There's also lots of live video as well you can watch nowadays.
I know, but it depends whether you like live bands, but I like going to concerts. I like seeing, I like going to festivals, etc. So sitting in a field and watching a YouTube clip isn't quite the same as going to a festival.
Oh yeah, I know that. Yeah. But when you're with a live video, you get to kind of like I kind of think about it. Who's going to watch like Kiss on their farewell tour, go back, I'm going to watch the old End of the Road tour. They're going to go back and watch stuff from the 70s, maybe the 80s, when they were really young and mean. So that's what I look at live, watching videos. I can go back to that era of that band where they're at their best, maybe.
Yeah. All right, well, let's wrap it up. So let us know in the comments if we've solved anything here, if you think it's valid enough to go back and just find new old music, or that's throwing in the towel and just being an old person or whatever. But you can be part of these Patreon panels by joining the Patreon situation. We have these panels all the time. Marco and Grant do a good job of keeping polling at the Patreon site for all our topics and everything. And so there's always a running tally of what are we going to talk about next, whether it's a Dark Horse album situation. So come join us there. But if not, just like and subscribe and all that stuff, and comment below what you think of this whole situation. So go listen to some old music.
Yes.